I've been a vegetarian for 31 years and I recently became a vegetarian carnivore. I'm going to share the story of how that happened, and we will begin with a simple idea which comes from this. This is a cherry. And if you had one food that you could eat for the rest of your life, what would you choose? And I've often thought about this in terms of countries. If you had to live in one country and choose just one country's cuisine for the rest of your life, which country would it be and why? But coming back to this smaller question in a way, if you had to just eat one type of food, like a cherry, for the rest of your life, how long would you live? What would your life be like? And this really comes down to the idea of, is food about diversity? So some would say that you need to have a huge diversity of food, in which case you have a cherry, you have spinach, you have other sorts of foods, and that is how you become healthy. But there are some foods that if you just eat that food, you can live, and you can live presumably quite healthily. Now, I'm not saying that either of these approaches is right, but the underlying idea for me is about health and metabolic health and overall health. And perhaps it's worth starting with my goals. What am I trying to achieve in food and in life? And it comes down to these things. I am part of a soccer team or a football team, and I play with older guys like myself. And I have found that my endurance, my speed, my strength is not up to scratch. And yet I play with guys who drink beer, who eat more food than me, who potentially live much more unhealthy lives, and yet they are able to perform better on a soccer pitch than I am. And that's not necessarily to do with skills, but there is something in the body that is happening and that is preventing me from getting to that level. And so my goals are about athletic recovery, athletic performance, and reintroducing speed and chaos, which is something that I have been doing quite a bit of. And that has kept me young. So if we think about this idea of identity and one food for life, being vegetarian for 31 years has been a large part of my identity, and it will surprise people for them to learn that I am now a vegetarian carnivore and what my pathway is into the future. And this process has involved a lot of questioning of myself in terms of, not necessarily why I might go and eat meat, but why did I become vegetarian in the first place? And these are stories we tell ourselves. These are, when we form these kind of identities, we tell stories to reinforce those identities. So I'm not entirely sure what the truth is, but I know that the story I used to tell about becoming vegetarian was that when I first started, I moved out of home, cooking meat was expensive and messy, and the way I thought about it at the time was those tobacco-stained houses with grease all over hot plates and range hoods. That kind of meat grease that just forms a layer upon layer upon layer, and you cannot get it off. So I thought about this as one of the reasons, and then I later said that I moved more to ethical reasons. And I think this is pretty big in terms of what I've recently been questioning, because although I haven't thought about it too much, it's sort of sat there at the back, which is, to what extent was I a vegetarian to virtue signal, right? Like to say, I'm more worthy than other people because I'm sacrificing myself and I'm caring for the world in a different way. But I think there's another idea that can sit underneath this, which is, well, what was my self-worth at that time, that I thought so lowly of myself that I couldn't eat meat, but other people could, and that was fine. And there's a similar kind of concept here around other people with antinatalism who don't think that they should have kids because, kids will make the world a worse place potentially, and so they sacrifice themselves. So I guess there's some questions about self-worth, but I haven't really dived too deep into that. I'm not going to in this session. because I'm going to concentrate on the physical aspects, what physical changes took place, and I think that those really begin to answer those deeper questions. So when I think about food, when I think about health, one of my main guiding principles is that I try and do everything that maintains and increases my testosterone naturally. And the great thing about that kind of statement is I get to choose what that is. Obviously, there are scientific reasons why your testosterone can increase naturally, and I include those, but I also include other things where I may not want to do something because I don't want to do it, and I'll think, well, that's going to affect my testosterone. If I do it, maybe my stress level rises. I'm not going to do it. Testosterone is a marker. As I move into different ways of eating, testosterone remains a marker. And also strength. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the idea of the promise of strict carnivore diets, and also where I've come from. But very briefly, the promise of carnivore diets is almost like that one food for life idea, that you have this simplicity, and I'll talk more about that as we go. But you also have this idea of deferred gratification and metabolic health. So those are the promises of a low carb diet or a carnivore diet. And metabolic health is something I would put up there as a key for me. That for me is super important. I have had a mother die from cancer. I see very poor metabolic health in the community, and I think that if you follow the herd, you are more likely than not to get metabolic issues, and the way the medical practice deals with that is somewhat questionable. So metabolic health is super important to me, and I'm exploring what kind of food and lifestyle changes can make you more metabolically healthy. I am not a doctor, so a lot of the stuff that I talk about here is opinion, and I'll try to frame it that way, but I do know that I will be wrong in some of the things that I say today. And this is the key, when we talk about being vegetarian for 31 years, that's an identity. During this story, I'm going to shift identities and just make them not quite as clear as they first started. And that is the part of learning from the experiments that I've been running and learning how to adapt by letting go of some of these identities and loosening them up. There will be people watching this who are wanting me to be very precise. What do you mean by a vegetarian carnivore? And maybe it's worth answering that question as best I can at this point in time. So, for the last few years, I have been eating differently to how I've eaten for 30 years or so. And part of that is maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I had zero tolerance for seed oils. I removed all seed oils from my diet completely. That means that I would not accept any seed oils whatsoever. So if someone was cooking in a fry pan and there was the potential that it had seed oils in it, I wouldn't eat it. And the way I think about that, and the way I think about a lot of substances in the environment, is the idea of fake fats. We obviously have three macros. We have fats, carbs, and proteins. Proteins are expensive. They're very difficult to synthesize and make fake proteins. Carbs are reasonably prolific and easy to get hold of and cheap to manufacture, but fats become rancid, they are more difficult to store, and so the money, when you think about it, is in fats. If you can make fats and make them fake, you can make a lot of money. And that's one of the big changes I have seen in the world, is the amount of fake fats that are occurring, and predominantly they're seed oils, but there are other forms of that. And the way I have thought about seed oils at that time, and a lot of products, I will call them for this conversation, is the idea of relabeling this stuff so that I can choose what to eat, and I can make a different choice in the moment based on a different framework. And my framework was to think about these things as ultra-processed entertainment. I also have another bucket, which is processed entertainment and entertainment. And when I think about ultra-processed entertainment, I think about things like sodas and things like corn chips with flavoring on them. Those kind of things I think of as ultra-processed entertainment, and so I no longer think of them as food. And the bucket I would put them in is with certainly certain Disney films. And I could, if I wanted ultra-processed entertainment, I can choose to watch a Disney film, or I can choose to have these kind of products and eat them. And what this meant for me was that I could very easily discard these kind of products. And if I wanted ultra-processed entertainment, well then I would listen to a Taylor Swift song, or I would watch a Disney film, and I would get that ultra-processed entertainment without consuming it into my body, or as some people might say you do when you watch stuff like that. This really set up a lot of cascading impacts in my life. The idea of having zero tolerance for seed oils means that your lifestyle immediately adjusts. I think it's really different to if you say, I will minimize my seed oils. Because when you minimize your seed oils, you are saying some is okay. And then you will be falling into certain behavioral patterns and certain social expectations that mean that you will consume these seed oils in social situations. And as for example, after I gave up seed oils, I went to a restaurant with my family, and we had called ahead to see, various different dishes. A dish that was presented in the menu looked like I could consume it, where I wasn't going to consume other meals for different reasons. And when we asked the waiters, they indicated that actually, even though that was a very simple food in the menu, it had been already prepared. So they had prepared the ingredients, and the preparation of the ingredients include coating them in seed oil. And what this meant for me at this time and over the last few years is the idea of eating out has completely shifted for me. It is no longer a source of entertainment for me. It is no longer a source of food for me. It's not something I'm interested in, but I also recognize that it has an impact on the people around me who still want to do those kind of activities, and that it does separate you somewhat from society. Like, it would be great to go out to dinner. It would be great to have a social environment around food in a way that I believe would be healthy. And that has obviously changed since I removed seed oils from my diet, because the idea of eating out is off the table. This, after a year or two, led to some other changes, but one of the key things that we see when we look at my history and where I've come from is this idea of being different is absolutely fine for me and a positive thing, in the sense that I don't need to follow the herd, and I am quite comfortable being different to other people. And that partly relates to the idea of, if you see the majority of the population are not metabolically healthy, and you choose to be metabolically healthy, then you can't do what the majority of the population is doing, and therefore you need to be different to some extent. And then the other part of this process, which you will come to understand in a way, is the idea of being humble and arrogant. So I think that I was arrogant about being fully vegetarian for 31 years. I talked about the virtual signaling, etc. And the way I think about arrogance is the belief that you are right, even though, and the way you project that onto other people and the way you present that, versus the reality of the situation. I draw a line between arrogance and also the idea of being right. If I was wrong about being vegetarian for 31 years, then I was arrogant. If these recent changes have made me rethink a lot of that stuff, then it's an opportunity for me to be more humble. And that's been a huge learning curve in a way, because I think, wow, there's so many things in life where you can be more humble and maybe not so sure about certain things and certain boundaries. So one of my frameworks after removing seed oils from my diet is to look at my macros. I've never looked at my macros before over my life, and I didn't really want to measure them. I'm not really the kind of person who wants to measure weights and work out calories, and although AI is very useful now and it can help with that, it's not something that I wanted to do. The framework I used, which worked really well for me at the time, was to think about food as high protein with some fats and then carbs last. In other words, using carbohydrates as the last thing to be eaten and almost like an overflow mechanism. Over time, I found that I desired carbs less and less, and the nutrients and the way that high protein and fats made me feel, I realized that that's where all my nutrients were coming from, and carbs were just filling space in a way. And it just meant that naturally I reduced my carbohydrate intake. And I haven't written it up here, but one of the channels that I've been watching is Low Carb Down Under. I've never liked that framing. I've never liked the framing of carnivore or low carb, because there is a negative connotation to both those things to a degree. Maybe not so much for carnivore, but it's a very strong word. And so instead of thinking about low carb, I just thought high protein, adequate fats or medium fats, and any carbs that I have after that are just overflow. And that didn't mean that I was thinking about it as a restriction, but more about what can I gain. And again, I'm quite comfortable cutting things out of my diet. I'll quite easily remove seed oils from my diet, even though it has those social implications. I can remove other things reasonably easily. So I have that discipline. I know a lot of people don't. But what most people do have is the ability to think about what it is they are getting. And so this idea of, yes, I want high protein, and yes, I want moderate fats, and yes, I want all the nutrients that my body wants, and then after that, I can entertain myself, or I can take in carbohydrates, and that is fine. And I think it was successful for me, and I think it will be successful for other people, but my goal here is not to train other people, it's just to tell my story, a once-off, how I became a vegetarian carnivore. After this period, I started to really kind of push on that idea of high protein, moderate fats. And being vegetarian, my diet became quite tight. It was very hard to get this kind of nutrient density to support strength and athletic performance and well-being, other than through a lot of these kind of foods. And so I was eating about 800 grams of high protein yogurt per day, handfuls of nuts, so that would be roast almonds, macadamias, and various other nuts, and then a bunch of eggs, and also halloumi cheese and other cheeses. And this was something that I thought would be unsustainable in the long term. I didn't really know where I could take it and how I could shift away from it. As an example, if I was ever hungry and I needed more calories or food, then I would consume nuts. So that was an easy thing I could grab hold of. And also cheese was also something like that. What is interesting about this is how it is really different to how I was eating 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I would be eating a loaf of bread a day quite easily. I bake my own sourdough. I could quite easily eat a loaf of bread a day with olive oil and honey on it, and just throughout the day just be hammering through this loaf of bread. I'd have other meals as well. But when I shifted to this high protein, some fats diet, I started to feel a different sense of hunger. And that one hunger, the hunger for carbohydrates when I'm eating bread every 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or every hour, that hunger requires satisfaction. You need to eat. And that's how I felt at the time. And that's how my body told me how to think about it at the time. When I started eating these kind of foods, these nutrient-dense, protein-dense, fat-dense foods, I had a different sense of hunger that was more calm. I could sit with that hunger for a much, much longer period of time, and I no longer think of hunger as one word. It is two words for me. It's either a carbs hunger or an everything else hunger. And that feeling or that well-being is something worth pursuing. The other thing I had done around the time of the seed oils is that when I had removed seed oils, I removed most of the fructose and sucrose in my life. I certainly wasn't adding any sugar, I wasn't having any soft drinks, that kind of thing, but I would have a banana a day or a mandarin or an orange, some kind of fruit maybe once or twice a day. And the other sugar that I was consuming, but I wasn't thinking of it as sugar, was a whole bunch of starches. That included bread, which I've spoken about, rice, and potatoes. These are effectively, when they get in your bloodstream, they're the same as sucrose and fructose basically. They're all forms of sugar. If you're removing table sugar from your diet, you're not necessarily removing that glucose load from your bloodstream. And particularly starches are something that can do that, or that can sort of hide in plain sight, so to speak. Quite naturally through this process I found that I was intuitively or accidentally or organically eating fermented foods. I was eating eggs, dairy, cheese, and other than that, everything else would be fermented. And even two of those things, the yogurt and the cheese, are fermented. And this was an accident, but I've come to think of it as, training the microbiome, but also pre-digestion. When you have sourdough bread or fermented vegetables or fermented products, it's like your intestines have been stretched and grown, and this fermentation that happens outside the body does some of the work so that when it enters your body, it can get done within those intestines. I don't know if that's scientifically correct, but it's certainly the way I have framed it. And I also believed at the time that was growing my microbiome and assisting my microbiome. And although there's no proof behind this or science behind this, but again, it's a way of thinking. I think of these diversity of foods and fiber and a microbiome. If you have a highly diverse microbiome and you're consuming that food throughout your intestines and digestive system, then your microbiome is super important and critical for that breakup of material to give you energy and to give you nutrients. But I think potentially with meat-based foods, so red meat, ruminant-based meats, I'm starting to think that the microbiome is not as important as the enzymes and the bile. Again, I'm not a scientist, this is just a way that I'm framing it, which is to think of the bile and enzymes as more important than the microbiome, and that the microbiome potentially can take care of itself on a carnivore diet, whereas when you have a lot of variety, a lot of fermented foods, you have to keep and maintain that microbiome the whole time. The very biggest thing in this period in my health comes from one product that is only in meat and yet there is a supplement for it, and that of course is creatine. Once I started consuming creatine monohydrate 5 grams a day or more, my mental clarity was off the charts. I see this as the thing that has unlocked everything for me in the last few years, because it's given me a mental clarity to then take some of these learnings and make new decisions. And I'm sure it has had an impact on my physical health and my strength training, but it's more that it's had an impact on my brain that has led me to the strength training, that has led me to these kind of changes. I have spoken a little bit about eating out. There's another aspect of this, which is travel. So once you start eating a low carb diet, and once you start saying, I will not have any seed oils, the idea of travel and the reality of travel shifts completely. And this is especially so if you have traveled previously and you relate travel to the food you've eaten while you've been traveling. And as an example, if I was to go to a particular country, trying to guess one off the top of my head, let's say it's Mexico, and there's a particular dish in Mexico that I might eat on a beach, on a resort that I didn't expect to go to. It was a bit of a surprise, and then every night I have that dish. Then the way I think about that dish is that it's going to connect me to that place, and it's connect me to some good feelings about that place. Once your diet shifts, once you are saying no to seed oils, then this idea disappears, because it's replaced with the idea of, if I travel and I go to a beach in Mexico, a different set of questions come up, which is, what can I do while I'm at the beach? Can I go surfing there? When's the best time to surf in Mexico? And then the only way that food really comes into it is, how am I going to eat when I travel if I'm not eating seed oils, or if I'm eating particular foods, or I'm prioritizing high protein and moderate fat? And a really good example of this is I've been to Japan. I went to Japan as a vegetarian. That meant that I didn't eat fish, and the food options for me as a vegetarian in Japan were terrible. And what that meant was going into 7-Eleven stores and getting a kind of cake with refined white flour and lots of additives, and using it to fuel my body. The result of that is that my memories of Japan are stretched and differ from the start to the end, because at the start I enjoyed Japan. It was an amazing social place in terms of how people operated, and the sense of design and scale of things was awesome, and the way you can have lots of Japanese people in an area and it doesn't feel crowded and intense, phenomenal. But then as that time went on, and as the holiday progressed, the food that I had consumed at the beginning of the holiday started to have an impact later on. And this really brought home to me the idea of blue zones. When we talk about Japan being a blue zone, we talk about the Mediterranean being a blue zone with excellent health. And one of my key observations is, when you travel to a particular country, it does not mean you are eating the food that is eaten in that country. I'm very confident that the Japanese people that were around me weren't eating the refined white cakes as their primary diet on a day-to-day basis, but the foods that they were eating weren't really available to me. Some people might be able to point me in a different direction and say, well, that's because you're a vegetarian, you weren't eating fish, you weren't eating meat. There are lots of options for people, and that may also be true. The other thing I wanted to mention about the past before I talk about what I'm eating now and how I am a vegetarian carnivore is the idea of the food from your childhood. Just as we have memories from travel and food, the memories we have as a child and eating are pretty key in our lives. We also know that insulin resistance is generally quite strong in children compared with older adults, and so it decreases over time. This means the idea of eating lollies as a kid is going to be really different to eating lollies as a 60-year-old person. Maybe people are kind of chasing that feeling of when they were a kid. And I remember being having a super sweet tooth. So I would be chasing sugar throughout the day. I'd have cereal in the morning and I'd be pouring table sugar onto my cereal and eating that. The other thing I remember from my childhood was that we would have meat and 3 veggies. It was kind of like almost a cliched Australian thing. I'd have some meat, I'd have some rice or some mashed potatoes, and then I would have sliced up green beans from the freezer. Now this wasn't every night, obviously, but that's how I think about that blandness of Australian food when I was growing up. And what I used to do, and I've thought about this a lot in the last week, is that I would pour tomato sauce on the meat. And I would pour tomato sauce onto the mashed potato, or tomato sauce onto the rice, and I'd mix it in. So I'd have this pink rice or this pink mashed potato. And then I never liked the beans, and they had a frozen sort of taste to them that was never lost. And I haven't eaten a frozen bean since I was a kid. And the way I think now about a lot of these ideas of condiments, and I talked a little bit about fake fats, which can be massive in condiments, things like commercial mayonnaises and other products, is this idea of chasing a particular electrolyte through that condiment. And in my case, what I think I was chasing was salt. When I was putting tomato sauce onto my rice and tomato sauce onto my mashed potato, I think it was the salt that was in that product that I was chasing. Now, obviously, products like that have other things in them, like acidity regulators, certain acids, and certain sugars, and that all contributes to that artificial flavour. And potentially all of those things were involved. But I look back on it now, I think, I wonder what would happen if I had just put salt on my rice, or salt on my mashed potato. And again, that was a period of time when table salt wasn't really a big thing, or it was looked down upon or seen as unhealthy. I don't remember ever using table salt and pouring it on. The exception being hot chips. For whatever reason, hot chips were allowed to have salt added to them, whereas other products weren't. I wonder why that is so. But I think it's probably to do with the demonization of salt in our society at that period of time. I'm going to now talk about where I'm eating at the moment and how that came to take place. It relates back to athletic stuff. Before I do that, I'm not sure how I wanted to address this directly, but when you make these kind of changes, even a simple change like removing seed oils from your diet, it's going to have an impact on your relationships. And I have felt that, I have seen that in my life, because I'm not going out as much. And the people around me may wish to go out more, or do wish to go out more. And what I want to do when I go out differs from what they want to do. How I want to live my life differs from how they want to live their life. And this is something that is present. You will know about this, but in my sense, my drivers were so strong that I'm willing to put this into neutral, I suppose, or have a different perspective on relationships, that nothing is stagnant in life. There's always change, and there is change in relationships as well. And that I can't predict how relationships will change as a result of this food, but that they will change. Which gets me closer to where I am today, it's now December, and in October there was an incident that really changed the trajectory of where I was heading. And that incident related to athletic performance. I was going to play a football match just at night. It was just training really, but I had had an injury all year to a patella tendon in my knee. I had been slowly getting my endurance and speed back up and my ability to move in an agile way. But I was like, oh, look, it's going to be a long match. Maybe I need to do something to prepare for that match so that I can play out that whole match, as opposed to just playing 20 minutes and then go, yeah, that's fine. And obviously, in hindsight, that's what I should have done, and I made a whole bunch of errors during this time. I'm not going to tell the full story of that, it's a bit long, but the short story is I accidentally poisoned myself. And I did that based on some scientific papers that have recently been released, which indicated that for endurance athletes, you could put more carbohydrates into their body than had previously been thought. So we had thought that during high intensity exercise, you could give carbohydrates, I think it was 90 grams in 60 minutes or so, and that was it. You had a threshold, that was it. But this research found that if you combine sucrose and fructose, you could get more of that carbohydrate into that athlete during endurance training. And I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. Obviously, I wasn't looking for these massive numbers of sucrose and fructose, but I thought, I will try that combination. Bear in mind, I hadn't had these kind of products for 1 or 2 years. I mixed some honey in with some fruit juice of a freshly squeezed orange. Not a whole lot of sugar load in there, but obviously different to where I had been. The other thing I put in there was a little bit of bicarbonate of soda, which some people say can help with endurance. And then I let that off gas because it was going to react with the orange juice. And then the last thing I put in there was some potassium in the form of cream of tartare. Now, it turns out that when you do this combination of electrolytes, I also put in sodium, so some salt. So I was looking for this idea of a electrolyte drink that could also hydrate me and also give me some energy in terms of fructose and sucrose. Now, what I've since learnt is that cream of tartare, although it has potassium, it's a different form of potassium, and ultimately this was a form of poisoning myself. I certainly don't recommend any of these items be combined, and it was done at a time when I knew less about what is possible during athletic performance and the role of carbohydrates in athletic performance, which is clearly now for me not a priority. So, I've gone through that exercise. You can see I'm humbled by it. A lot of mistakes in that particular instance. But let's talk about what it led to. It led to an immediate, at the time of that training, atrial flutter. So my heart has 4 chambers. My top chamber, one of those, started just fluttering. So it wasn't pulsing at the right time and it wasn't priming the rest of the heart in the right way. This means, my heart is racing super fast and I'm not recovering in the same way. That happened immediately on the training. And then in the week subsequent to that training and game exercise, I experienced significant bloat. So I had my belly was like a pregnant belly. And 1 week later, I then played another match of football. I had some watermelon at halftime, and after that, I was unable to eat anything, keep anything down, and everything was just being thrown up. I knew what was happening in my body at an intuitive level, but also because I'm quite thin, I thought this is not good for someone who's thin like me. So I need to get some fuel into my body. I'm throwing up. I played intense exercises. What am I going to do? And the answer was to take myself off to hospital. I went via a GP, and long story short, I knew my body wasn't able to eat anything. I was fully bloated, and I also had the atrial flutter, which I was unaware of at the time. So when I go into hospital, I'm kind of like, shuffled around, and then they take my ketones. So they prick my finger, and my ketones were 5.9 or 6 or something like this. And that's known as starvation ketones, when your body's kind of starting to eat itself. Everyone starts freaking out. They put me on heart monitors. They start to look at trying to work out what's really going on. And that's when they find that I have an atrial flutter. So I've gone from being, returning to sport, really enjoying it, recovering from my patella injury, I'm moving, I'm playing football, loving it, and now I'm in hospital, I'm literally starving, I'm on a drip, so that's really what I wanted to do. Once I got on the drip, I was like, at least I've got something coming into me. And then I've suddenly got a heart issue. And at this point, you obviously start to question your choices and how you end up there. And I was in the public system, so I had a lot of different doctors at different times. And it was really interesting how the medical system worked and how problem solving occurred. Obviously, there's a lot of bloods taken. They're looking at, is there something wrong with the pancreas? Is there blood issues with this or that? But I never got the sense that they were looking for the root cause. Like, why did I bloat up? Why was I unable to eat? What was going on there? And was there a relationship with the atrial flutter? And I'm going to skip over that medical stuff because it's not that important, other than the idea of, hey, this is really interesting that root cause doesn't appear to be a motivating factor for doctors. Doctors are overworked. I'm pretty sure that's the case. But what's the incentive for a doctor to get to root cause? Generally, they're skipping around lots of different patients. The root cause of disease and other metabolic issues is often, diet or metabolic issues. They eventually reveal themselves after people have run enough tests or enough time has passed. And it became very clear to me at that time that it was on me. It was best if I took control of my health and what my next steps would be, and then use the medical system to guide me, which I have done when it comes to cardioversion and the atrial flutter and other things. But irrespective of that, I wanted to talk about, again, how food plays into that system. And one of the things that I thought about in that time, because I had a lot of time in hospital where I'm not really doing much, and I can't really do much. One of the things I thought about was when my mother was dying of bile duct cancer, one of the things we were doing as a family is we were feeding her a product. I'm not going to mention the commercial name for it, but it's this idea of a product that you give to people when they're not able to eat other foods or they're not eating foods. And so it's like high calorie count. And it's a product that has seed oils in it. And it struck me as I was sitting in hospital, waiting for my own recovery, that, it's possible, it's not 100% by any means, it's possible that my mother's issues were caused by seed oils and other products she was eating. And then yet while she's in hospital trying to, eat more and get better, which is obviously not the case if it is terminal bile duct cancer, which it was in this case. Again, she's being fed seed oils. And as I thought about these things, my appetite had come back in hospital. And what I think happened is that I had eaten sucrose, fructose, I had had that potassium poisoning, so to speak, and I'd done it late at night, and then my gut motility had slowed down, my whole gut had stopped moving, and had just needed to reset and remove the fluids and remove whatever was going on in there. When my appetite came back, it came back massively. I did not hesitate to eat what was put in front of me. Typically that was high carbohydrate things that I had not eaten for years, right? So I was given apple juice and orange juice, it's basically sugar water, and I was smashing these things down, and I thought to myself, I'm not going to stress about it being sucrose or fructose. I need to recover, because in my head I'm a thin person. I don't want to lose muscle, I don't want to lose weight. That is my concern. It's not the concern of maybe the most of the population, but under eating or under consuming, being very lean was a concern to me. So I'm like smashing these things down. And then a really interesting thing happened for me. My body naturally said, enough. You have had enough carbs. And so from smashing these things down, I was still eating my own sourdough bread that I make myself, so it's pre-fermented and all that kind of stuff. So I was eating that, I was eating cheese, and I just got super hungry for proteins. And what was really interesting is the menus in a hospital are phenomenally bad. Like I was given a sheet in the morning, and I could choose my breakfast, lunch and dinner for the multiple days. And I looked at the food options there. So there were food options like a salad with eggs, or something with cheese, but a lot of things that I would not consider foods, and certainly not low carbohydrate foods. In other words, there weren't vegetarian options for me that were high protein, moderate fat, low carbs. It was all the opposite. It was high carbs, moderate fake fats, low protein. And I did what a lot of people don't do in these situations. I wrote on the menu. So the menu was just tick boxes. You could only tick box. There was no free text area for it. Because they had salad with eggs, I thought they will be hard-boiled eggs. And so I just crossed it all out and put 5 hard-boiled eggs, etc. all the way along. And this gets to the heart of humanity, because what happens next is that the chef comes to see me. So the chef from the kitchen of a commercial kitchen in a commercial kind of hospital comes to see me, knocks at my door and goes, "Oh, I noticed you want some eggs. Do you want some fish?" And I said, "Yep, sure, great, that's a great idea. I just don't want any seed oils on it, etc." And then they supplied me that steamed fish. I had my boiled eggs and had exactly what I had wanted, and it wasn't even an option that was presented to me. The point being that there are always options that aren't presented that you can exercise in life. Mind you, I was very lucky in that sense. There is another point to that, which is that people want to be helpful. And I talked about going out for dinner and how I would go out for dinner, and there was this pre-prepared food. I thought it would be fine. Turns out, actually, it's not. It's already prepared with seed oils. People don't like to hear that. The waiters, the chefs, they don't want to hear that. But what they want to do then is help you. And so this idea of the humanity of it has two aspects. One is really positive. When I was in hospital, do you want fish? Do you want eggs? Great, we'll do it for you. What happened in hospital is what happens in a lot of other areas of life, is when they said, do you want fish? And I said, yes, that will be fantastic. Then they start to add to it. Do you want fish? We can put this with it and that with it. We can make a sauce with it. We can do this, we can do this. It's the idea of making something more complex. And that's how love is communicated. So in this instance, the chef from the hospital was showing love. Hey, I can get you that fish. Oh, and I can make it so much better than just bland fish. And here's how I'll do it. This is something that I see socially everywhere. Family members, friends will do this kind of additive. You know, let's add on to these things because that's a sign of love. And that happens in restaurants and anywhere else in that manner. And it's accepting that that's how people think about things. But again, because I've had 1 or 2 years of practice of that, because I'm not afraid to be different in that sense, I have incorporated that into the way I live my life. And I'm sure it offends people at times, but that's the choice I'm making because the athletic performance, the metabolic health is more important to me than if I occasionally offend some people in that respect. What's interesting about that is that is a choice that I've made in my life and that I've made acceptable to me in my life, and that is somewhat socially acceptable in this society. I do think of other cultures and other countries where this will not be possible or very, very difficult for people to achieve and still have social standing or save face. And yeah, that's regrettable, I suppose, is the best way to put it. I'm going to move on to where I am now. Like, what am I eating now? How did I make this change? I come out of hospital. I've had this experience. I've also got atrial flutter, which is affecting my ability to sprint and do exercise. And so I really have to bring that down to a minimum. And I thought to myself, this might be a good time to experiment again with my diet, to learn from this idea of fructose and glucose and the bloating that happened. And I hadn't had an answer on the bloating. It wasn't quite going away. And I thought, I'm going to see if I can make a change to my microbiome. And at this point, I thought, maybe I will introduce ruminant meat to this. And I began to think about how would I go about that. I knew this idea of being a vegetarian for 31 years would be a real blockage for me in terms of identity. And it was hard for me in the sense of thinking about that as almost like an on-off switch. Like, it's almost like doing Duolingo every day and learning a language. You've got that streak running, 31, 32 years of being vegetarian. If I go and eat meat for a month and then I go back to being vegetarian, it's like I've broken the streak. And I knew this was a strong identity pull for me. And I thought, I have to break this down mentally. And I began to think about what is this idea of meat? How can I recontextualize it for myself? And all the logical things that people might say about how agriculture harms animals more than meat production does. None of this logical stuff I thought was going to work for me. I thought I needed a different framework for it. And I began to think about a couple of things. Really how I had thought about people who ate meat while I was vegetarian and some of the positives I had thought about at the time. One of those stories comes from an Australian writer, I think it was David Foster, but I could be wrong about that. And he talks, whoever it was, the author talks about how they killed a cattle, I don't know, what do you want to say, killed beef. They killed this cow and how they went about it, and then they butchered it themselves. And I remember at the time, this is maybe 15, 20 years ago, thinking, oh, there's something very human and realistic and authentic and integral about killing the animal that you eat, as opposed to going to the supermarket and just getting the meat. And so in a weird way, me killing an animal and then butchering it myself was a weird kind of framework that I believed I could apply. But I also know from a regulation point of view, you can't do that sort of stuff in Australia. It's just not done. And the other aspect of that probably did help is this idea that I think of cows as having good lives in Australia. They're roaming, they're outside, they're not in grain lots. So the beef that you eat in Australia is all grass fed. And also those cows have a great life, and then they have a short death, and that's it. And that differs for me in terms of poultry, and it differs for me in terms of pigs, because when you're travelling through Western Australia, you don't see pig farms, and if you do, it's a big shed that you don't know is a pig farm. Whereas when you travel, you do see cows under trees or in paddocks and stuff like that. Another thing that I thought about is a more recent experience where I had met a farmer who owned cows, and he had spoken about how cows have their own individual personalities. You get to know these cows and appreciate them for their humor or how they act, but he still shifts them off to the abattoir. And I thought, actually, again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a cow having personality, and also the farmer saying, yep, it's time for it to go to the abattoir. And I suppose it comes back to this idea that cows live a good life and then they die, and that's it. The other aspect I think it's important to talk about in this period of time is that, I like cherries. I could easily eat this cherry now and enjoy the flavour of it. But when it comes to meat, I don't love the taste of it. It's not something that tastes fantastic. And I know other people do. And so as I'm thinking about, I could be eating meat again, it's not drawing me in the same way that a cherry would. And so I knew that I had to find different mental ways of dealing with this. One way that I thought of dealing with this is to go into a butcher and have a chat to a butcher and see what would happen if I had told them that I hadn't eaten meat for 30 years and I was thinking about it. Stepping into the butchery, I was amazed to find that so many of the meats looked pre-processed. There were things like satay sticks. And overall, this gave me the impression that a lot of this preparation included seed oils, the very thing I was looking to avoid. I asked the butcher if he had any liver, and the answer was it was coming on Wednesday. And you might be thinking, why would you start with liver if you've been vegetarian all your life? And the answer is because I felt that if I could eat liver, then I could really eat anything. And also, we know that when you eat liver and other offal, that you don't need a lot of it to get what you need from it. And in fact, you shouldn't eat a lot of it. By stating that Wednesday was when liver arrived, it gave me a deadline. It gave me something to think towards loosely. And when that moment arrived, I went into that butcher, I bought the liver, I came home, I steamed it and cooked it. And the way I was thinking about approaching this liver was that I probably would not like the taste. And to get around that, I thought, how about I train my microbiome to like the taste of liver before I physically taste it. And the way I did that is that once I had cooked it, I chopped it into very small pieces, around about that size. It's a bit hard to see. And my goal
was to be able to eat the liver without tasting it. And to do that, I would take some of these pieces, throw them in the back of my throat, take a sip of water, and swallow it whole. This way, I did not taste it, but it was entering my system and hopefully training my microbiome. This is about 25 grams or 1 ounce of cooked liver, and there is no way that I could eat all of that using that method. In fact, it was probably more about 5 or 6 grams, but the amount wasn't really the point. The point was, can I eat it? Can I change my identity and consume a meat product? And also, can I change my microbiome so it starts to want these kind of foods if it is beneficial to me? After doing that for a while, I did it intermittently over a few days. I then went to another butcher, and when I spoke to him, it was a great conversation. You could tell that he had also been through a journey towards carnivore, and we were talking about muscle building and other things in relation to the diet. And he convinced me in that moment to take home a ribeye steak, just a thin one, as he put it. And I did, and I stuck it in the fridge, and I knew that I had to eat it or get rid of it in the next day or so. And I didn't have anything to cook it with. I could have cooked it in my kitchen, but there are other people living in my house who don't eat meat. I know how I thought about meat prior to this move, and so I didn't want to make a mess, make a different smell for the people I was living with. And as a result, I looked at what was available and decided to buy an air fryer. Bought the air fryer, and then again, I have that moment of, am I going to be able to eat this meat? I don't even like the taste of meat. I don't miss it. I knew what it would taste like, but it wasn't something that I was looking forward to. That's when I heard about a technique that can make it easier in these situations. And the idea is you take 3 chews and then you either swallow or spit it out. And that can resolve the anxiety, but also just you can listen to your body in that moment and say, well, what is it that I need, or what is it that I want? And so I did that. I cooked up that steak. I made it rare, which is not how I remember as a kid having my meat. As a kid, I remember having it well overdone. And that, I think, is probably the result evolutionarily, that we tend to overcook meats if we've had a bad experience with bacteria or some kind of thing like that. And so in this instance, I knew the meat was fresh. I was taking a totally different approach, reasonably rare, had 3 chews, and then I swallowed it. And that was about 160 grams of meat, which was, to me, quite a lot when I'm coming off no meat whatsoever, having just had 5 grams of liver over a few days. And so that was the main moment where I had made the step to eating red meat. From there, I started to move into eating more red meat, more eggs, and I will share some of the observations of that. Let's head back to the post-it note so I can remember where I'm at. But as we move away from beef liver into what's the experience like of going into carnivore, well, some of these, let's pull a few of these out. Let's talk about some of these. The first thing is supplements. Prior to this, I had spoken about how things like creatine had made a massive difference in my life. And there's a whole industry around supplementation. I think the AFL is sponsored by supplement companies. There's a lot of money in supplements. And if you are not getting nutrients in your body, then you can be inclined to go towards supplementation. But it became clear to me that with carnivore, a lot of these supplements just disappear. You don't need them anymore. For instance, creatine, once I'm eating a kilo of red meat per day, then I'm taking in the equivalent of about 4 or 5 grams of creatine. So I don't need to supplement with creatine anymore. Likewise, vitamin C, other products, there's less of a need in the body to take them. Now, having said that, I'm currently not taking many supplements. I'm taking magnesium for a different reason. But I think a lot of these ideas around supplements are potentially now for me temporary. So instead of being, I'll take vitamin D forever in my life, it's now a case of what does my body need now? Let's supplement up to that level and then let the diet take over. Having said that, one of the recent articles I read around nutrients suggests that glycine can be useful as a supplement because thiamine or another amino acid affects the absorption of it. In a weird way, even though being vegetarian I would have had less glycine, it's possible, having moved to the carnivore diet, that I'm actually getting less glycine. So that's something I'm considering. I'm also considering upping my creatine slightly and supplementing in that for a little bit, mainly for the mental clarity and getting more than 5 grams per day. But overall, there's a whole drawer of supplements in this kitchen, and I'm looking forward to just binning them for myself. I spoke a little bit about an air fryer, and I want to talk very quickly about the idea of simplifying your cooking apparatus, right? So really at the moment when it comes to cooking, I'm using an air fryer and I'm using a saucepan. The saucepan is for eggs, so I boil my eggs, and the air fryer is for meat, and that's it. Now what's interesting in that is that I renovated this kitchen a little while ago. I'm very happy with the visuals of this kitchen, with the gold stainless steel and the leveling of the hot plates. There's a number of elements in this kitchen I'm really happy with. But having gone carnivore, you can see that I don't need all this space. I don't need all this equipment, and I don't need all the food that's in the fridge and the freezer. Let's take a look at that in a moment. And just to give you an example, have a look at all these different implements like measuring cups, cookie cutters, funnels, cherry pipper, can opener. I don't need any of that at all because fundamentally I don't need it to cook meat. So other things I don't need, or just to show you how simple your kitchen can become, let's take a look in the fridge and the freezer and just do a little bit of an order. And I'll talk about what I eat from this fridge and what you'll see very visually the difference in it. So none of this stuff I eat. I have been doing my own sauerkraut, and I have had a little bit of that while I've been on carnivore and may return to that, so I'll use that as an example. There is also butter, which I'll talk about in a moment, which I'll eat, but then when I look at the rest of this, none of this is eaten by me. None of this is eaten by me. If I return to yogurt, then I will eat some of those yogurts. And if I return to cheese, I will eat some of those cheeses. Same with the mushrooms. But otherwise, the rest of this stuff is not used by me. I do eat eggs daily, and I'm going to talk about how I cook those. And I also keep some of the rendered fat from the ground beef that I air fry. I mix that in with the eggs and with a little bit of salt. So of that fridge, I could quite easily store all of my needs within maybe this shelf here. That's how little I need of all this space. And there is a bigger kind of point to this, which is not just about space, but what you do with all this stuff, right? Like there's two elements to that. One is all this stuff. If I want to make a recipe, it's very complicated. I've got to combine lots of things at different times. I've got to use lots of different implements. I've got to use containers and cut it up. For me, I no longer have that issue. And the other one is waste. So all of these products incorporate waste, whereas when it comes to my ground beef, in this case it's frozen. You know, I probably could use something other than these plastic bags, but out of this whole freezer, I'm just using one of these trays. It's just with the ground beef, and that's it. The way I approach this ground beef is I buy 2 kilos of ground beef, and I buy 2 lots of the 2 kilos of ground beef, and then one I divide into 5 lots, so each is 400 grams. The other I divide into 4 lots, so it's 500 grams. Together that's 900 grams, and that's how much ground beef I am eating each day. I am also occasionally eating other things like short ribs, but at the moment it's mainly just ground beef and eggs. And this kind of brings me to another point, which is around, well, what's the role of rendered fat? So I spoke a little while ago about taking the rendered fat from the air fryer and then mixing that with eggs the next day. That fat is congealed because it's in the fridge. And I think a lot of the issues with moving to carnivore have to do with your tolerance for fat. I've talked about the microbiome, but I think what happens when you move to carnivore is you concentrate more on enzymes and bile and less in the microbiome, because the enzymes in the bile sort of break down that fat and then move it through the digestive system. Which brings me to a difficult point for a lot of people, and that is the idea of diarrhea. I had diarrhea, explosive diarrhea, for 24 hours, and I think that may have been related to the amount of rendered fat I was eating, and it partly could have been due to bacteria in some food that I'd eat, because I was also eating halloumi cheese at that time. But if it was due to fat, it will be related to when I had some chuck steak and I slow cooked it, and there was lots of fat in the bottom, which I poured over it as liquid fat, and I consumed that. And that was very easily consumed by me, but what I do know is that fat has been something that my body is slowly adapting to. And as an example, I've never particularly liked butter, but when I first started this move to carnivore, I could only eat a very, very small sliver of butter, and it just made me feel nauseous and full and sick all at once. And slowly over time, my tolerance for that has built up, and now I can eat a little bit more of it. And so what I think happened when I was eating the chuck steak with the liquid fat, the way you consume that, it may be the trigger back to your brain to say, hey, I've had enough, I can't take anymore, is a little bit slower than if you're eating saturated fat that is in a more solid form, like butter. To another point, which is something I hadn't thought of, and probably you wouldn't think of it if you're vegetarian and moving to carnivore until it happens. And that's the idea of like what it does to your teeth and what meat does. And I found that I have a few gaps in my teeth. When I was a younger child, I ate poorly, and it was reflected in my tooth health, and I had fillings and gaps and certain things. When I stopped sugar, all of those dental issues disappeared, and we know that when we have disease in our gums or disease in our mouth, that travels through the digestive tract and affects other parts of your body. So having healthy teeth and gums is important, and obviously diet will play a big part in that. The thing I hadn't considered is the idea of the fibre of the meat. Being vegetarian, I would eat zucchini and mushrooms, all sorts of different foods, but they largely broke down and went straight into my stomach, whereas the fibres in meat would stick between my teeth, which was brand new for me, and it told me that meat just is a different texture, and you chew meat a lot more than you chew a mouthful of zucchini or mushrooms or bread or cheese or anything that kind of crumbles and moves into small particles. There's something about meat that your body wants to grind it down and work it through the mouth. And I do wonder if that extra working in the mouth gives it more enzymes, more saliva, and helps it on its way, right? Like, this is all about health, and I do wonder if that's the case. As I began to move towards carnivore, I cut out plant food. I was still eating a little bit of cheese with it, and one of the things that was a problem for me was understanding the volume of food. To give an example, before undertaking carnivore, I would easily eat 2 eggs in the morning, some slices of halloumi cheese, and then later that afternoon, or later that morning, I would have, 500 grams of high protein yogurt, some kind of lunch, maybe some fish or something like that. And then in the afternoon, I'd have a few slices of bread. And when you think about eggs in that context, 2 eggs is fine. It seems like a lot in the morning to have 2 eggs. But when you go carnivore, the volume changes. And suddenly I'm looking at, well, if I just eat eggs and I don't eat meat, then I have to eat an enormous amount of eggs per day. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it was something like 20 eggs per day just to get my caloric intake, which mentally was very hard to work out. Physically was very hard to achieve because I don't want to eat that many eggs per day. And just understanding the volume of food when I first started was important because I didn't want to lose any more weight. I didn't want to go underweight. And I think if we come back to the idea of the fat and getting used to the fat in meat, then I think it could be very easy to undereat because your body might say, hey, I've had enough fat, but it still wants more calories. And maybe it's okay for the body to defer that for a number of days or a week or so, but I didn't want to take that risk. And so I tracked the volume of food, and I was under eating in terms of the calorie intake. And one of the hardest things with that was just uplifting the volume. The idea of eating 5 eggs in a sitting needed to become normal as opposed to 2. And the way I do my eggs now is I boil 12 eggs at a time. I boil them for 6 minutes so that the yolk is still jammy, but the egg is solid. And then I stick them in the fridge like I showed you. But I found, and I am finding, that my body's rejecting eggs at the moment. It's saying, I don't want to have any more eggs. And so I've just dropped back to 3 eggs per day with some rendered fat, and that's it. But the big change for me around eggs was the idea that even though the white has been cooked, it looks cooked or it's solid, I found that I have to cook it further in order to remove that nauseous feeling. Other people talk about the histamine content of eggs, but I find if I cook the whites for longer, I don't have as many issues. So now, having cooked them for 6 minutes, cooled them, the yolk is still jammy, then when I want to have the eggs I want to have, I put back on the stove, I cook them for another 6 or 7 minutes, which means the heat comes into the egg, it cooks the whites again and further, but leaves the center or the yolk still somewhat jammy, but I know that that white has been completely cooked. It's still, the volume of food has until this week been really tricky for me, but now I can just listen to my body, and my body is telling me when I've had enough, or how long I can wait before I have another meal. It seems like I want to have 2 meals per day, but I'm currently having 3 meals just because I want to be able to ensure that my fat tolerance is okay throughout, and I don't want to dump a lot of fat in two eating episodes per day or 2 meals per day, and instead I spread that fat over 3 meals, and that seems to be working for me. And thankfully, the diarrhea stopped after 24 hours. If it had gone any longer, I'm pretty sure I would have quit carnivore at that time. It was, it sets you off in terms of your mood, it sets you off in terms of where you can be, and it is an indication that you're going in the wrong direction, and a very, very strong indication. I got through that stage. I'm now I don't have that issue anymore. And really, for me, it is coming back to the purpose of this. You know, this idea of having 2 meals per day, the idea of having less cleaning up to do, less cookware, less food to shopware, all this simplification is amazing. But this initial period of moving to carnivore has been mentally on my mind. So I don't want to be thinking about food this much. The promise is that I don't need to think about food. Now let's just see, as we continue, if that delivers. I've noticed it delivering in the hours between my meals. But again, I still have to kind of problem solve and troubleshoot this process, particularly when I've had the diarrhea things that I spoke about, or some of the other issues around how do I cook this. And ultimately, if I can free that mental space and simplify further, then I achieve that promise. Even water tastes different. A lot of people are talking about carnivore diets as something that you need to do for a long period of time. Some even go further and say you have to do it in a particular way. That might mean not eating cheese, only eating ruminant meats, eating at certain times of the day, and all of a sudden, something that promised to be simple can become complex. Many years ago, I tried an experiment where I did not drink alcohol for a month. And because I felt better, I continued it, and I haven't drunk alcohol for 15 years. And I'm using the same approach when it comes to this lifestyle and diet. It has been 30 days since I started eating meat, and I can feel that my body is becoming fat adapted. But it will take even longer for that to translate to athletic performance. I have been injured and unable to exercise. And as a result, as I return to exercise, I will be dealing with the fat adaptation and also the lack of conditioning. But I find myself reacting strongly against those who say you need to do carnivore for 90 days before you decide whether it's good or bad, or you need to do it in a particular way. And I think that's part of my contrarian nature that has led me to this diet in the first place. But also, underneath that, there is this other notion where I see a lot of people undertaking carnivore because they have no other option. They've run out of pathways due to health issues, and now they are choosing carnivore as a last resort, and in many cases it's been very successful. That is not the case for me. I don't have hugely significant health problems that I know of, and the other thing that's different about me is I'm very, very, very able to have discipline and reject certain approaches and carry through on things for a long period of time. I still think that these grapes will taste better than any beef and meat that I've eaten in the last month, but I don't have any desire or need to eat these grapes. At the same time, I know that if I ate that grape, just that one grape, I would enjoy it more likely than a lot of obese people who may eat thousands or hundreds of grapes a day. And throughout this process, I have eaten small amounts of other food. For instance, yesterday there was a cucumber growing in the garden. I took some of it and I ate it, and I didn't have any issues doing that. And the other thing that I've been eating that has not been meat over this past month has been macadamia nuts, because I can sense that my body is adapting to fat, but my body was already adapted to the fat of macadamia nuts. And I see this food as a transition and a way of moving more towards animal fats. And that more and more has been the case. What does this mean? These small amounts of food, I could quite easily eat this grape. What do these small amount of foods mean, and what do they mean to me? And I think to bring this full circle, it has to do with the idea of being a vegetarian carnivore. This is an experiment that I'm running. The experiment has not run its course. It requires extra time to see if I can perform athletically, to sense my testosterone levels, to see my energy levels on a day-to-day basis. But so far it is tracking well. And it has a high benchmark to hit, because when I was a vegetarian carnivore and I wasn't eating meat, I was feeling extremely healthy and doing very well. The difference here will be how the athletic performance is managed and recovery is managed as I've introduced meat, if everything else stays the same. And I suppose that's the point, that this may not stay the same. I have been 31 years as a strong vegetarian and very dogmatic in what I would eat and what I wouldn't eat as a result of that. And as I move through this current phase, I'm aware that I may change again. I may revert, I may change completely, and I may change in a minor way. At the moment, I am eating about 800 grams of beef mince, ground beef mince per day, and a few eggs and a little bit of butter. And that is running at about $13 a day. And the weird thing about that is I have no idea how much my previous grocery bill would have cost when I was eating purely vegetarian. To go back to the very start, it's really unclear to me how I first decided to choose carnivore. Obviously, I had these bigger goals around athletic performance and overall health. I do think that creatine played a large part in that initial thought, and also an Australian show called Alone. It was set in Tasmania, and individuals were pushed into the countryside, into the bush, to fend for themselves. And as I thought about the struggles that they were under, and also, throughout that, they're talking about the desire for protein. And those who had not eaten much began to think about food all the time. And what kind of food did they think about? Largely protein, I imagine, but it's, maybe they thought about other particular foods. But it made me think two things. One, how interdependent we are on food networks as a whole on our day-to-day life, and how separate that makes us from nature, and how much of a struggle it is to survive if you don't have a village around you, if you don't have these interconnected networks of food. And from there I began to think a little bit about macros. Every person needs a certain number of macros to survive each day. And I realized I had never tracked my own macros at all throughout my life. And as I began to do that, I then began to lift my protein. I began to feel a lot stronger and better, and it has directly led to where I am today. I am a vegetarian carnivore, and I wanted to give you this video because I didn't want to get stuck in the loop of carnivore. I see so many people who are carnivore and talking about it every day. For me, I wanted to get this lengthy video out to explain as much as I could in terms of where I am at this moment in my life. And I may follow up in the future with the results of the athletic performance and how my diet has shifted. But I'm very clear that I don't want to be someone who talks about this diet endlessly. I think I'd just like to drop in a few months, let you know how it's going, and shift the attention and meaning of my life away from this immediate food issue, which is similar to those individuals on Alone, as I struggle to work out how much I need each day, to understand exactly how the carnivore diet is affecting me. And slowly over the 30 days that has dropped, and I'm looking forward to ridding myself of that and shifting my life to greater meaning and purpose.